What would you do if someone tried to tear your children away from you forever? What lengths would you go to protect the ones you love most? Tonight, I'm going to tell you the incredible true story of Clara, an enslaved woman who appeared obedient and invisible to her masters, but who harbored a secret strength that would change everything. This is the story of how one mother's love became more powerful than chains, whips, and the entire plantation system designed to break her spirit. In the antebellum South of 1858, enslaved people were considered property, bought, sold, and traded like livestock. Families were torn apart without warning, children sold away from their mothers, husbands separated from wives. The system was designed to crush hope, to make resistance seem impossible. But sometimes, in the darkest moments, extraordinary courage emerges from the most unexpected places. If stories of courage and resistance inspire you, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell, because tonight's story will leave you speechless. This is a tale of intelligence, determination, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and her children. Clara's story isn't just about escape. It's about the hidden networks of resistance that existed right under the noses of slaveholders, the careful planning that took years to execute, and the incredible risks that ordinary people took to help others find freedom. It's about how someone who was considered property outsmarted an entire system designed to keep her enslaved. So settle in, because this journey will take us from the misty cotton fields of Georgia to the bustling ports of freedom, through swamps filled with danger and safe houses filled with hope. This is the story of how Clara proved that no master is a match for the determination of a mother fighting for her children's future. The morning mist at Willow Creek Plantation hung thick and heavy over the cotton fields, like a shroud that seemed to muffle even the birds' songs. It was early September 1858, and the Georgia heat was already building, even though dawn had barely broken through the canopy of ancient oak trees that lined the plantation's main drive. The air was thick with humidity and the sweet, cloying scent of magnolia blossoms, a beauty that masked the brutal reality of life for the 300 enslaved people who called this place their prison. Clara moved through the big house with the same quiet efficiency she had perfected over 15 years of bondage. At 32, she had learned to make herself invisible, a survival skill that had kept her alive and relatively safe in a world where a wrong look, a misunderstood word, or even a moment of defiance could result in the whip, the auction block, or worse. Her dark eyes never lingered too long on any white face. Her voice never rose above a whisper when addressing the masters, and her movements were calculated to draw no attention. To Master William Thornton and his wife Margaret, she was simply part of the furniture, reliable, silent, and completely under their control. They had no idea that behind her submissive exterior, Clara possessed one of the sharpest minds on the plantation. But they didn't know about the maps. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the slave quarters, wrapped in oiled cloth and tucked inside a hollowed-out Bible, were hand-drawn sketches of escape routes that had been passed down through whispered conversations for decades. These weren't just random drawings. They were detailed guides created by people who had attempted escape, some successful, others not. Each map contained crucial information: which roads were patrolled most heavily, where sympathetic whites might offer help, which rivers could be crossed safely, and most importantly, the locations of safe houses along the Underground Railroad. Clara had memorized every line, every landmark, every symbol that marked the difference between freedom and death. She knew that the old mill 20 miles north had a hidden cellar where fugitives could rest. She knew that the Quaker family near the Oconee River would provide food and directions, no questions asked. She knew which stars to follow on cloudy nights and which plants could be eaten if food ran out. This knowledge hadn't come easily. For 5 years, Clara had been cultivating relationships with other enslaved people across 3 counties, building a network of information that was invisible to white eyes, but vital to those who dared to dream of freedom. She had traded favors, shared resources, and earned the trust of people who risked everything by talking about escape. "Clara!" Margaret Thornton's shrill voice cut through the morning air like a whip crack. "Bring me my tea, and make sure it's hot this time. Yesterday's was barely warm, and I won't tolerate such laziness." "Yes, ma'am," Clara replied, her voice steady and submissive, though inside she felt the familiar surge of anger that she had learned to suppress. Mrs. Thornton was a petite woman, with pale skin and nervous hands, but her cruelty was legendary among the house slaves. She took pleasure in finding fault, in humiliating those who served her, in reminding everyone of their place in her carefully ordered world. As Clara prepared the tea in the kitchen, she caught sight of her children through the window. Samuel, at 8 years old, was helping old Moses repair a broken wagon wheel. The boy had inherited his unknown father's strong jaw and broad shoulders, but his eyes, those intelligent, questioning eyes, came from Clara. Even at his young age, Samuel asked too many questions, observed too much, and showed a stubborn streak that both worried and impressed his mother. Little Mary, only 5 years old, was playing with cornhusk dolls near the kitchen garden. She possessed a spirit that Clara both admired and feared. The child laughed too freely, looked too directly at white folks, and had an innocence that the plantation system would soon try to crush. Mary still believed the world was a place of wonder and possibility, and Clara was determined to preserve that belief for as long as possible. As Clara served the tea in the parlor, she caught fragments of conversation between Master Thornton and his brother James, who had ridden over from the neighboring riverside plantation. The two men were huddled over account books, their faces grim with worry. "The debts are mounting faster than I can pay them, William," James was saying, his voice heavy with concern. "Cotton prices have dropped again, and the bank is getting impatient. They're talking about calling in the loans." Master Thornton, a tall man with greying hair and the soft hands of someone who had never done physical labor, ran his fingers through his hair in frustration. I know, I've been avoiding their letters for weeks, but what choice do I have? The crop won't be ready for harvest for another month, and even then, the prices are so low." "You need to consider liquidating some assets," James said quietly, glancing around to make sure no servants were listening. "I know it's not pleasant to think about, but you have valuable property here. Some of your people would bring good money at auction." Clara's blood turned to ice. In the language of slavery, liquidating assets meant only one thing: selling human beings. She had heard these conversations before, had seen families torn apart when masters faced financial difficulties, children sold away from parents, husbands separated from wives, entire communities scattered to the winds. "I've been thinking the same thing," Thornton admitted reluctantly. "There are several who would bring top dollar. That boy of Clara's is getting to be good size, strong for his age, and the little girl is pretty enough that she'd make a good house servant in a few years." Clara's hands trembled as she refilled their cups, but she forced herself to remain calm to keep her breathing steady. Years of practice had taught her to become invisible during these conversations, to blend into the background so completely that the white folks forgot she was there. "Have you spoken to any dealers?" James asked. "There's a man from Alabama coming through next week. He specializes in young stock, says he can get premium prices for children who can be trained from an early age. And I know a woman in Charleston who's looking for a girl to train as a lady's maid." The teacup slipped from Clara's fingers and shattered on the hardwood floor. Both men looked up, annoyed by the interruption. "Clumsy girl," Thornton muttered. "Clara, clean that up and get out. And be more careful. That china came from England." "Yes, sir," she whispered, dropping to her knees to gather the broken pieces. But inside, her world was collapsing. They were planning to sell her babies, to separate them not just from her, but from each other. Samuel would go to Alabama to work in the cotton fields. Mary would be sent to Charleston to serve in some stranger's house. Clara would never see either of them again. That evening, as Clara tucked her children into their small cot in the slave quarters, she studied their faces in the flickering candlelight. Samuel had grown so much in the past year. His legs were getting longer, his shoulders broader. He was becoming valuable as a field hand, and Mary, with her bright smile and quick mind, would indeed make an excellent house servant. "Mama," Mary whispered, snuggling closer to her mother's side, "why do you look sad?" Clara forced a smile, stroking her daughter's soft hair. "I'm not sad, baby girl. Mama's just thinking." "Thinking about what?" Samuel asked. Even at 8, he was perceptive enough to sense when something was wrong. "About how much I love you both," Clara said, which was true, even if it wasn't the whole truth. about how proud I am to be your mama." But she was thinking about much more than that. She was thinking about the maps hidden under her floorboard. She was thinking about the network of people who had promised to help if she ever needed to run. She was thinking about the stories she had heard of successful escapes, of families who had made it to freedom in the north. Most of all, she was thinking about a conversation she had had with old Moses just the week before. Moses was the plantation's blacksmith, a man in his 60s who had been enslaved since childhood, but who possessed skills that made him valuable and relatively trusted. He also had connections throughout the county, other skilled slaves who moved between plantations, free blacks who worked as craftsmen, and even a few white abolitionists who secretly opposed slavery. "Clara," Moses had said as she brought him water during his work, "you know I've been watching your children grow up. That boy of yours is getting to be the right age where masters start thinking about selling. And little Mary, well, she's got the kind of spirit that either gets broken or gets her sold away from everything she knows." Clara had nodded, understanding the warning in his words. "I want you to know," Moses had continued, lowering his voice to barely above a whisper, "that if the time ever comes when you need to make a choice, there are people who will help. People who believe that families should stay together, no matter what the law says." Now, as Clara lay awake listening to her children's steady breathing, Moses's words echoed in her mind. The time for choosing was coming faster than she had expected. For weeks, Clara had been cultivating relationships with other enslaved people across the county, building a network that extended far beyond Willow Creek Plantation. There was Ruth, who worked in the Thornton house and overheard every conversation between the master and mistress. There was Moses, who could forge travel papers and had connections with free blacks in Savannah. There was old Ben, who had attempted escape twice and knew which routes the patrollers watched most closely. There was also Sarah, a house slave on the neighboring plantation who had a sister working for a Quaker family near the Oconee River. And there was Thomas, a skilled carpenter who traveled between plantations and could carry messages without arousing suspicion. The network was invisible to white eyes, but it was real, an underground railroad of information, favors, and quiet rebellion that connected every plantation in the region. It was built on trust, mutual aid, and the shared understanding that survival sometimes required taking enormous risks. As Clara stared at the ceiling of the slave quarters, listening to the sounds of 300 people trying to find rest after another day of forced labor, she made a decision that would change everything. If Master Thornton was planning to sell her babies, she would not wait passively for her world to be destroyed. She would act first. The next morning, Clara began to put her plan into motion. During her work in the big house, she paid closer attention to the family's routines, noting when they went to bed, when they woke up, and when the house was left unguarded. She observed the patterns of the overseers and patrollers, memorizing their schedules and identifying the times when surveillance was lightest. She also began to gather supplies, taking small amounts of food from the kitchen, dried corn, salt pork, hardtack biscuits, and hiding them in various locations around the plantation. She collected other necessities, matches wrapped in oiled cloth, a small knife, strips of cloth that could be used for bandages, and a worn blanket that wouldn't be missed. Most importantly, she began to say goodbye. Not obvious goodbyes that would arouse suspicion, but subtle farewells to the people and places that had been her world for 15 years. She spent extra time with old Moses, learning everything he could teach her about reading the stars and finding direction in the wilderness. She had long conversations with Ruth about the Underground Railroad contacts in Savannah. She even visited the small cemetery where her mother was buried, standing quietly by the unmarked grave and promising that her grandchildren would grow up free. 3 days after overhearing the conversation about selling her children, Clara's worst fears were confirmed. She was dusting the parlor when Master Thornton met with a well-dressed stranger, who introduced himself as Mr. Jameson, a slave trader from Montgomery, Alabama. "I understand you have some young stock for sale," Jameson said, settling into a leather chair with the casual confidence of a man who made his living buying and selling human beings. "Indeed I do," Thornton replied. "A boy, 8 years old, strong for his age. Good bloodlines. His mother is one of my most reliable workers. He'll make an excellent field hand in a few years, and he's already showing aptitude for mechanical work. And the girl? 5 years old, very pretty, intelligent. She'll be perfect for housework. Very obedient, like her mother. She could be trained as a lady's maid or even a children's nurse. Jameson nodded approvingly. I can offer you 800 for the boy, 600 for the girl. Cash payment, and I'll take them off your hands by the end of the week. Sold, Thornton replied without hesitation, as if he were discussing the sale of livestock rather than children. Clara's hands trembled as she continued dusting, but she forced herself to remain calm to keep breathing normally. Inside, however, her heart was breaking. The end of the week. That gave her only 4 days. That night, Clara sat with Ruth in the shadows behind the kitchen, speaking in voices so low they could barely hear each other. They're selling Samuel and Mary, Clara whispered, her voice hollow with despair. End of the week, to different places. Ruth's eyes widened with shock and sympathy. Both of them? Oh, Clara. Samuel's going to Alabama to work cotton. Mary's going to Charleston to be a house servant. I'll never see either of them again. Ruth grabbed Clara's hands, squeezing them tightly. Then you know what you have to do. Clara nodded. She had always known this day might come. The maps hidden under her floorboard weren't just dreams. They were preparation for this exact moment. I need help, Clara said. You'll have it, Ruth replied without hesitation. Moses can forge papers. Old Ben knows the safest routes. Thomas can get word to the contacts in Savannah, and I can make sure you have a head start before anyone notices you're gone. What about after we're gone? Clara asked. They'll question everyone. They might punish people for helping us. Ruth was quiet for a moment, considering the risks. We've all made our choices, Clara. We've all decided that some things are more important than safety. Your children's freedom is worth whatever consequences come. Over the next 2 days, Clara moved with careful precision, finalizing every detail of her escape plan. She studied the maps one final time, tracing the route with her finger. Through the swamp to avoid the main roads, then north to the Oconee River, where sympathetic Quakers were known to help fugitives. From there, if they could make it that far, the Underground Railroad would guide them to Savannah and eventually to freedom in the north. Moses worked late into the night, creating forged travel papers that identified Clara as a free woman named Sarah Johnson, traveling with her children to visit relatives in Savannah. The papers wouldn't survive close scrutiny, but they might be enough to get past casual questioning. Old Ben shared his knowledge of the swamp routes, drawing detailed maps in the dirt and making Clara memorize every landmark. The water's low this time of year, he told her, so you can wade through most of it. But watch out for the deep channels. They'll pull you under before you know what happened. And stay away from the cypress groves on the eastern edge. That's where the gators like to nest. Thomas carried messages to contacts along the escape route, alerting them that fugitives might be coming and asking for whatever help they could provide. The network began to mobilize, preparing safe houses, gathering supplies, and coordinating the complex logistics of moving people through hostile territory. On Thursday evening, as Clara served dinner to the Thornton family, she listened to them discuss their plans for the weekend. Master Thornton would be traveling to Savannah on business, leaving Friday morning and returning Sunday evening. Mrs. Thornton would be visiting her sister in Augusta, taking most of the house servants with her. The plantation would be left in the care of the overseer, Jake Morrison, who was known for his heavy drinking and lax supervision. It was perfect timing, almost too perfect. Clara wondered if Ruth had somehow influenced the family's travel plans, but she didn't ask. Some questions were better left unanswered. That night, Clara held her children close and told them stories about birds that flew so high they could see the whole world spread out below them, about rivers that carried people to magical places, about stars that guided travelers through the darkest nights. "Mama," Samuel asked, his young face serious in the candlelight, "do you think we'll ever see the world like those birds?" Clara kissed his forehead, breathing in the sweet scent of his hair. "Yes, baby, I believe we will." "When?" Mary asked, snuggling closer to her mother's side. "Sooner than you think, little one, sooner than you think." Clara didn't sleep that night. Instead, she sat by the small window of their quarters, watching the stars and preparing herself mentally for what was to come. She thought about her mother, who had died when Clara was 16, and wondered what advice she would give. She thought about the father of her children, a field hand who had been sold away before Samuel was born, and hoped he had found some measure of freedom wherever he was. Most of all, she thought about the choice she was making. By tomorrow evening, they would either be free or dead. There was no middle ground, no safe option, no guarantee of success, but there was also no alternative. She would not stand by and watch her children be sold into a lifetime of bondage. She would not let them grow up believing that they were property, that their lives had no value beyond their ability to work for others. As the first light of dawn began to creep across the sky, Clara made her final preparations. She retrieved the hidden supplies and the forged papers, checked and double-checked her memorized route, and said a silent prayer to whatever gods might be listening. By tomorrow night, everything would be different. Friday dawned grey and humid, with heavy clouds that promised rain before evening. Clara moved through her morning routine with mechanical precision, but every nerve in her body was alert, every sense heightened by the knowledge that this was the last day she would ever spend as a slave. The Thornton house was in chaos as the family prepared for their respective journeys. Mrs. Thornton fluttered about like an agitated bird, barking orders at the house servants and changing her mind about what to pack every few minutes. Master Thornton was in his study, going over account books and preparing for his business meetings in Savannah. "Clara," Mrs. Thornton called from the top of the stairs. "Come help me decide which dress to wear to my sister's dinner party." "Yes, ma'am," Clara replied, climbing the stairs with the same submissive demeanor she had perfected over the years. But inside, she was counting the hours until nightfall. As she helped Mrs. Thornton choose between two nearly identical dresses, Clara listened to the woman chatter about her social obligations, her sister's new house, and the latest gossip from Augusta society. It was surreal to think that in a few hours, while Mrs. Thornton was sipping tea and discussing fashion, Clara would be running for her life through the Georgia wilderness. "I do hope the weather holds," Mrs. Thornton said, peering out the window at the threatening clouds. "Rain would make the road so dreadful, and I simply cannot arrive at my sister's looking like a drowned rat." "No, ma'am," Clara agreed, though privately she hoped for a downpour. Rain would make tracking more difficult and provide cover for their escape. By noon, both Master and Mrs. Thornton had departed, taking with them most of the house servants and leaving the plantation under the loose supervision of Jake Morrison. Morrison was a crude man in his 40s who had worked as an overseer for various plantations throughout Georgia. He was known for his quick temper, his fondness for whiskey, and his general incompetence when it came to managing day-to-day operations. Clara spent the afternoon in a state of controlled terror, going through the motions of her daily duties while her heart hammered against her ribs. She cleaned rooms that she would never see again, prepared food that she would never taste, and spoke to people she might never have the chance to say goodbye to properly. At 4 o'clock, she found Moses in the blacksmith shop, ostensibly to bring him water, but really to collect the forged papers he had prepared. "Everything's ready," Moses said quietly, slipping the documents into her hand. "Remember, you're Sarah Johnson, traveling to Savannah to visit your cousin. Your husband died last year, and you're looking for work. Keep the story simple, and don't volunteer information unless you're asked directly." "Thank you," Clara whispered, tucking the papers into her apron. "For everything." Moses nodded, his weathered face grave. "You're doing the right thing, Clara. Those children deserve a chance at freedom." At 6 o'clock, Clara served dinner to the remaining white staff, Morrison and 2 junior overseers who lived in the big house. The men were already drinking heavily, celebrating their temporary freedom from the master's supervision. Clara encouraged their drinking, refilling their glasses frequently and making sure they had plenty of food to keep them occupied. By 8 o'clock, Morrison was well on his way to being drunk, and the other overseers weren't far behind. They had moved to the front porch with a bottle of whiskey, where they sat telling crude jokes and complaining about their jobs. Clara used this opportunity to make her final preparations. She retrieved her hidden supplies from various locations around the plantation, consolidating everything into a single bundle that she could carry on her back. She also collected some additional items, a small pot for cooking, extra clothes for the children, and a precious bar of soap that might help them blend in with free blacks if they reached civilization. At 9 o'clock, she went to the slave quarters to collect Samuel and Mary. The children were playing quietly with other kids from the plantation, unaware that their lives were about to change forever. "Samuel, Mary," Clara called softly. "Come inside. It's time for bed." As she tucked them into their cot, Clara's heart ached with the knowledge that this was the last time they would sleep in the only home they had ever known. Tomorrow night, if they were lucky, they would be sleeping in a safe house somewhere along the Underground Railroad. If they were unlucky. Clara pushed that thought away. She couldn't afford to think about failure. "Mama," Mary said, looking up at her with sleepy eyes. "So you seem different tonight. Are you sad about something?" Clara smoothed her daughter's hair, marveling at how perceptive children could be. "No, baby girl, Mama's not sad. Mama's hopeful." "Hopeful about what?" Samuel asked. "About tomorrow," Clara said, which was true in ways they couldn't yet understand. "Now go to sleep. Tomorrow is going to be a very special day." At 10 o'clock, Clara made her move. The plantation had settled into its nighttime routine, with most of the enslaved people asleep in their quarters, and the overseers passed out drunk on the front porch. It was time. "Samuel, Mary," she whispered, gently shaking her children awake. "We're going on a journey." Samuel, always the more perceptive child, sat up immediately, instantly alert. "What kind of journey?" "Mama, where are we going?" "Somewhere safe," Clara replied, helping them dress in their warmest clothes. "But we have to be very, very quiet. This is our secret and no one else can know about it." Mary rubbed her sleepy eyes, confused but trusting. "Is it like a game, Mama?" "Yes, baby girl, it's like the most important game we'll ever play. And the most important rule is that we have to be completely silent unless Mama says it's safe to talk." Clara had rehearsed this moment in her mind dozens of times, but the reality was more emotional than she had expected. As she gathered their few possessions and prepared to leave the only home her children had ever known, she felt a mixture of terror and exhilaration that made her hands shake. They crept through the slave quarters, past the sleeping forms of people who had been Clara's community for 15 years. She wanted to wake them all, to take them with her, to save everyone from this life of bondage. But she knew that was impossible. Tonight she could only save her own children. The first part of their journey took them across the cotton fields, where the tall plants provided cover, but made navigation difficult in the darkness. Clara had walked these fields countless times during harvest season, but tonight, with adrenaline coursing through her veins and her children's lives depending on her decisions, everything looked different. Samuel walked beside her with determined steps, his small hand gripping hers tightly. Mary rode on Clara's back, her arms wrapped around her mother's neck, occasionally whispering questions that Clara answered with gentle shushes. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 45 minutes, they reached the edge of the swamp. This was where the real danger began. The swamp would hide them from pursuit, but it was also home to alligators, venomous snakes, and treacherous patches of quicksand that could swallow a person whole. "Listen to me carefully," Clara whispered to her children as they stood at the edge of the dark water. "We're going to walk through this swamp, and it might be scary. You might hear strange sounds and the water might be cold, but Mama knows the way and we're going to be safe as long as we stay together." "Are there monsters in the swamp, Mama?" Mary asked, her voice small with fear. "No monsters, baby girl. Just animals that are more afraid of us than we are of them. And remember, we're going to be very quiet, like mice." They entered the swamp slowly, Clara testing each step to make sure the ground was solid. The water was knee-deep on her, which meant it came up to Samuel's waist and would have been over Mary's head if she had been walking. The murky water was surprisingly warm, heated by the day's sun, but it was also alive with unseen creatures that brushed against their legs as they moved. The swamp was a symphony of night sounds, the splash of fish jumping, the rustle of night birds settling in the cypress trees, the eerie calls of owls hunting in the darkness, and the occasional splash of something larger moving through the water. Mary whimpered softly at each new sound, and Clara pulled her closer, whispering reassurances. They had been walking for perhaps an hour, following a route that old Ben had described to Clara in careful detail, when they heard it, the distant sound of dogs barking. Clara's blood turned to ice. It was too soon. They shouldn't have been missed until morning when the house servants came to wake them for their daily duties. "Mama, what's that sound?" Samuel asked, his voice tight with fear. "Hush, baby," Clara replied, but her mind was racing. Someone must have checked on them during the night. Maybe Ruth had been caught helping them. Maybe one of the overseers had sobered up enough to do a security check. Maybe Morrison wasn't as drunk as he had appeared. The barking was getting closer, and Clara could hear men's voices shouting orders. They had bloodhounds, dogs trained specifically to track runaway slaves. The animals could follow a scent trail for miles, even through water. Clara made a desperate decision. Instead of following the main path through the swamp that old Ben had recommended, she turned deeper into the wetlands, toward an area he had warned her about, a maze of waterways and small islands where even experienced hunters sometimes got lost. "We're going to play a different game now," she told her children, forcing her voice to remain calm despite the terror clawing at her chest. "We're going to pretend we're fish, swimming through the water without making any splashes. Can you do that for Mama?" For the next 3 hours they waded through increasingly deep water, Clara carrying Mary when the child grew too tired to continue. The sounds of pursuit grew louder and then faded, then grew loud again as the search parties spread out through the swamp. Several times, Clara heard men calling to each other, their voices carrying across the water with frightening clarity. "They went this way," one voice shouted. "The dogs have the scent." "Check that island over there," another replied. "And watch out for gators." Clara led her children deeper into the maze, following waterways that seemed to twist back on themselves, climbing onto small islands only to wade back into the water when she heard voices getting too close. Her legs ached from fighting the current, her back burned from carrying Mary, and her heart felt like it might explode from the constant terror. But she kept moving, driven by a mother's desperation and the knowledge that capture meant not just punishment for her, but a lifetime of separation from her children. As the first light of dawn began to creep across the sky, they found themselves on a slightly larger island covered with thick vegetation and fallen logs. Clara pulled her children onto dry land, and they collapsed, exhausted and shivering despite the warm air. "Are we safe now, Mama?" Mary asked, her small voice barely above a whisper. Clara looked back toward the plantation, where she could see smoke rising from the morning cooking fires. Somewhere in that direction, men with dogs and guns were searching for them, and the search would only intensify as word spread of their escape. "Not yet, baby girl," she said, pulling both children close to her, "but we're going to be. Mama promises." As they rested on the island, Clara could hear the search continuing around them. The barking of dogs echoed across the water, and she could see torches moving through the distant trees. But for the moment, they were hidden, and that was enough. She used the time to check their supplies and plan their next move. According to her mental map, they were still about 12 miles from the Oconee River and the network of abolitionists who might help them reach true safety. But first, they had to survive the day. The search parties were systematic and thorough. Clara counted at least 6 different groups of men, each with dogs combing through different sections of the swamp. They were offering a reward for information. She could hear them shouting the amount across the water. $50 for the woman and children, one voice called. Dead or alive. $50 was more money than most people in the county saw in a year. Every white person for miles around would be looking for them, and even some free blacks might be tempted by such a large reward. As the sun climbed higher, Clara made another crucial decision. They couldn't stay in the swamp much longer. The search was too intense, and they needed to reach the Underground Railroad contacts before word of their escape spread too far. But they also couldn't travel during daylight hours, when they would be easily spotted. She decided to wait until evening, and then make a desperate push toward the river, avoiding the main routes and traveling cross-country through farmland and forest. It was risky, but staying in the swamp was becoming impossible. Around noon, Clara heard voices very close to their hiding place. She gathered her children and led them to the center of the island. where a massive fallen cypress tree created a natural shelter. They crawled underneath the trunk and lay perfectly still, barely breathing. "Check that island," a man's voice said, so close that Clara could hear his footsteps splashing through the shallow water. "Looks like someone might have been here." For 20 agonizing minutes, men searched their island while Clara and her children huddled in their hiding place. The searchers passed within 10 feet of them, close enough that Clara could smell tobacco on their clothes and hear their individual conversations. "Damn fool woman," one searcher complained. "Probably drowned herself and the children rather than face punishment." "Morrison's offering a $50 reward," another replied. "That's good money for a few days' work." "If we find them alive, we split the reward 3 ways, a third voice added. "If we find them dead, we still get paid. But Morrison won't be happy about losing his property." Clara closed her eyes and held her children tighter, feeling their small bodies trembling against hers. They were talking about her babies as if they were livestock, as if their lives had no value beyond their monetary worth. After what felt like an eternity, the searchers moved on to the next island. Clara waited another hour before allowing herself and her children to move, and even then, she kept them hidden under the fallen tree. As afternoon turned to evening, Clara began to prepare for the next phase of their journey. She knew that leaving the swamp would expose them to new dangers, but staying was no longer an option. The search was too intense, too well organized. They needed to reach the Underground Railroad before the net closed around them completely. At sunset, as the sky turned deep orange and purple, Clara gathered her children and prepared to leave their hiding place. The next 12 hours would determine whether they lived as free people or died as fugitives. "Are you ready for the next part of our adventure?" she asked Samuel and Mary, trying to keep her voice light despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. "Yes, Mama," Samuel replied, his young face set with determination that broke Clara's heart. He was too young to understand the full magnitude of what they were attempting, but old enough to know that their lives depended on success. "Where are we going now?" Mary asked. "To find some friends who are going to help us," Clara said, which was true if they could reach them alive. As darkness fell over the swamp, Clara led her children back into the water, for what she hoped would be the last time. They had survived their first day as fugitives, but the hardest part of their journey still lay ahead. The second night of their escape began with an ominous rumble of thunder in the distance. The storm that had been threatening all day was finally approaching, and Clara wasn't sure whether to be grateful or terrified. Rain would wash away their scent trail and make tracking more difficult, but it would also make travel treacherous and increase the risk of getting lost. As they waded through the dark water toward the edge of the swamp, Clara could feel the electricity in the air that preceded a major storm. The wind was picking up, causing the cypress trees to sway and creak ominously overhead. Lightning flickered in the distance, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. "I'm scared, Mama," Mary whispered, clinging tightly to Clara's neck as they moved through the increasingly choppy water. "I know, baby girl," Clara replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "But remember, we're brave like the birds in our stories. We can fly through any storm." Samuel walked beside them with grim determination, his small hand gripping Clara's tightly. At 8 years old, he was beginning to understand the gravity of their situation, and Clara could see the fear in his eyes, even as he tried to be strong for his little sister. After 2 hours of careful navigation, they finally reached the edge of the swamp. Ahead lay farmland, and beyond that, the small town of Milledgeville and the roads that would take them north toward the Oconee River. But first, they had to cross several miles of open country where they would be completely exposed. Clara had studied this part of the route carefully, memorizing the locations of farmhouses, roads, and potential hiding places. According to her information, most of the farms in this area used enslaved labor, which meant the white families would be hostile to fugitives. But there were also several properties owned by poor white farmers who worked their own land and might be less likely to report runaway slaves. The first drops of rain began to fall as they left the protection of the swamp. Within minutes, the drops became a steady drizzle, and within an hour they were walking through a downpour that soaked them to the skin and turned the dirt roads into rivers of mud. "This is good," Clara told her children, shouting to be heard over the rain. "The rain will wash away our tracks and make it harder for the dogs to follow us." But the rain also made travel much more difficult. The roads became treacherous, and Clara had to carry Mary most of the time to prevent the little girl from slipping and falling in the mud. Samuel struggled to keep up, his small legs working hard to navigate the slippery terrain. They walked through the night, staying off the main roads and following fence lines and creek beds whenever possible. Several times, they had to hide in ditches or behind farm buildings when they heard horses approaching. Each time Clara's heart pounded as she waited to see whether the riders would pass by or stop to investigate. Around midnight, they encountered their first real crisis. They had been following a creek that was supposed to lead them around the town of Milledgeville, but the heavy rain had turned the normally shallow stream into a raging torrent. The water was moving too fast and was too deep for them to cross safely. Clara stood on the bank, holding her children close and trying to figure out what to do. According to her mental map, they needed to cross this creek to reach the safe route north, but attempting to ford it in these conditions would be suicide. "Mama, what are we going to do?" Samuel asked, having to shout to be heard over the roar of the water and the pounding rain. Clara studied the creek, looking for alternatives. About a quarter-mile upstream, she could see what looked like a bridge, probably just a fallen log, but it might be enough to get them across. The problem was that using the bridge would take them closer to the main road and increase the risk of being spotted. "We're going to find another way across," she told her children. "Follow me and stay close." They made their way upstream, fighting through thick underbrush and slipping on the muddy bank. The fallen log was indeed there, a massive oak that had toppled across the creek, creating a natural bridge about 3 feet wide. But the log was slippery from the rain, and the creek was running high enough that falling in would mean certain death. Clara tested the log carefully, making sure it would support their weight. Then she turned to her children with the most important instructions of their lives. "I'm going to carry Mary across first," she said. "Samuel, I want you to wait here until I come back for you. Do not try to cross by yourself, no matter what happens. Do you understand?" Samuel nodded, though Clara could see the fear in his eyes at the thought of being separated from her, even briefly. Clara picked up Mary and stepped onto the log. The little girl wrapped her arms around her mother's neck and buried her face against Clara's shoulder, too frightened to look at the rushing water below. Step by careful step, Clara made her way across the makeshift bridge, fighting to maintain her balance on the slippery surface. Halfway across, her foot slipped, and for a terrifying moment, she thought they were going to fall. But she managed to regain her balance and continue forward, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. When she reached the other side, Clara set Mary down in a safe spot and immediately started back for Samuel. The little boy was standing exactly where she had left him, shivering in the rain, but following her instructions perfectly. "Your turn, brave boy," Clara said when she reached him. "Climb on my back and hold on tight." Samuel was heavier than Mary, and the return trip across the log was even more treacherous. But Clara's determination to save her children gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. Step by step, breath by breath, she carried her son to safety. When they were all together again on the far side of the creek, Clara allowed herself a moment of relief. They had overcome their first major obstacle, but many more lay ahead. The rain continued through the night, and by dawn they were all exhausted, soaked and shivering despite the warm air. Clara found a small grove of trees that provided some shelter, and they huddled together to rest and eat some of their meager supplies. "How much farther, Mama?" Mary asked, her small voice weak with exhaustion. "We're doing very well, baby girl," Clara replied, though privately she was worried about how much more the children could endure. "We just need to keep being brave for a little while longer." As the sun rose, Clara could see smoke from cooking fires in the distance, signs of civilization that meant both opportunity and danger. They were approaching the area where underground railroad contacts were supposed to be located, but they were also entering territory where slave catchers and federal marshals were more common. Clara made the decision to travel during daylight hours, despite the increased risk of being spotted. The children were exhausted, and she was afraid that another night of walking in the rain would be too much for them. Instead, she would try to reach the Quaker settlement near the Oconee River before nightfall. She altered their appearance as much as possible, using mud to darken their skin and tearing their clothes to make them look like free blacks who had fallen on hard times. She also coached the children on their cover story. They were traveling to visit relatives in Augusta after their father had died in an accident. "Remember," she told Samuel and Mary, "if anyone asks, your name is Johnson, not your real name, and I'm your mama Sarah, not Clara. Can you remember that?" Both children nodded solemnly, understanding that their lives might depend on getting the story right. They began walking north along back roads and farm paths, avoiding the main highways where they were more likely to encounter patrols. The landscape was beautiful in the morning light, rolling hills covered with pine forests, small farms with neat fields of corn and cotton, and clear streams that sparkled in the sunshine. But Clara couldn't enjoy the beauty. Every sound made her jump. Every person they saw in the distance made her heart race. They were walking through enemy territory, where a single mistake could mean capture, punishment, and separation. Around noon, they encountered their first real test. They were walking along a dirt road when they heard horses approaching from behind. Clara quickly led her children into a patch of woods beside the road, but they weren't fast enough to avoid being seen. "You there!" a man's voice called out. "Stop where you are!" Clara's heart sank, but she forced herself to remain calm. She stepped out of the woods with her children, putting on the submissive demeanor that had kept her alive for so many years. Two white men on horseback approached them. One was middle-aged and well-dressed, probably a plantation owner or merchant. The other was younger and rougher-looking, with the hard eyes of someone who made his living through violence. "Where are you folks headed?" the older man asked, his tone suspicious, but not immediately hostile. "Augusta, sir," Clara replied, keeping her eyes downcast. "My husband died last month, and we're going to stay with my cousin until I can find work." "You have papers?" the younger man demanded. Clara's hands trembled as she reached into her apron and pulled out the forged documents that Moses had created. The older man took them and studied them carefully while Clara held her breath and prayed that the forgery would pass inspection. "Sarah Johnson," the man read aloud. "Says here you're from Milledgeville." "Yes, sir, we've been walking for 2 days." The man looked at the children, who were doing their best to appear tired and harmless. Mary was clinging to Clara's skirt, while Samuel stood quietly beside them, his eyes fixed on the ground. "These your children?" the younger man asked. "Yes, sir, Samuel and Mary." The two men exchanged glances, and Clara could see them weighing their options. The papers looked legitimate, and her story was plausible. But something about the situation was making them suspicious. "Lot of runaways in the area lately," the older man said slowly. "Big reward for anyone who helps catch them." "I wouldn't know anything about that, sir," Clara replied. "We're just trying to get to Augusta." After what felt like an eternity, the older man handed back the papers. "You be careful on these roads," he said, "and if you see any suspicious characters, you report them to the authorities." "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." The two men rode away, but Clara could feel them watching her as they disappeared down the road. She waited several minutes before leading her children back onto the path, her hands still shaking from the encounter. "Did we do good, Mama?" Mary asked. "You did perfect, baby girl. Both of you were very brave." But Clara knew they had been lucky. The next encounter might not go so well. They continued walking through the afternoon, staying alert for any signs of pursuit or danger. The landscape gradually changed as they moved north. The farms became smaller and less prosperous, and Clara began to see signs that they were approaching Quaker territory. The Quakers were a religious sect that opposed slavery on moral grounds. Many of them were active in the Underground Railroad, providing safe houses, food, and transportation for fugitive slaves. But they were also watched closely by authorities, and approaching them was risky. As evening approached, Clara began looking for the landmarks that would indicate they were near the safe house she had been told about. According to her information, there was a Quaker family named Patterson, who lived in a white farmhouse with a red barn, about 2 miles east of the Oconee River. Just as the sun was setting, Clara spotted the house in the distance. It matched the description perfectly: white clapboard siding, a red barn, and fields of corn that provided cover for approaching the property without being seen from the road. "Is that where we're going, Mama?" Samuel asked. "I hope so, baby boy. I really hope so." Clara led her children through the cornfield, moving carefully to avoid damaging the crops. As they approached the house, she could see warm light glowing in the windows and smoke rising from the chimney. It looked like a scene from a peaceful dream, but Clara knew that appearances could be deceiving. When they reached the edge of the yard, Clara hesitated. This was the moment of truth. Either the Patterson family would help them, or they would turn them into the authorities. There was no way to know which until she knocked on the door. Taking a deep breath, Clara led her children across the yard and up the steps to the front porch. Before she could lose her nerve, she knocked softly on the door. Footsteps approached from inside, and the door opened to reveal a middle-aged white woman with kind eyes and graying hair. She looked at Clara and the children for a moment, taking in their muddy clothes and exhausted faces. "Are you friends of the friend?" the woman asked quietly. Clara recognized the code phrase she had been taught. "Yes, ma'am. We're traveling north, and we were told you might be able to help us." The woman, who Clara assumed was Mrs. Patterson, stepped aside and gestured for them to enter. "Come in quickly," she said. "You're safe now." As Clara and her children stepped into the warm, welcoming house, Clara felt tears of relief streaming down her face. They had made it to the Underground Railroad. They were still far from true freedom, but for the first time in 3 days they were safe. "My name is Elizabeth Patterson," the woman said, closing the door behind them. "And you don't need to tell me your real names unless you want to. What you need now is food, dry clothes, and rest. We'll worry about the next part of your journey tomorrow." As Mrs. Patterson led them to a warm kitchen where soup was simmering on the stove, Clara realized that they had crossed more than just geographical boundaries. They had crossed from a world where they were property to a world where they were human beings deserving of help and compassion. It was the first step on a long road to freedom, but it was the most important step they would ever take. Clara woke the next morning in a real bed for the first time in her life. The sensation was so foreign that for a moment she couldn't remember where she was. Then the events of the past 3 days came flooding back, and she sat up quickly, looking around for her children. Samuel and Mary were sleeping peacefully in a small bed across the room, their faces relaxed in a way Clara hadn't seen since they began their escape. Clean clothes were folded neatly on a chair, and through the window she could see the sun shining on the Patterson family's peaceful farm. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Clara," Mrs. Patterson's voice called gently. "Are you awake? I have some breakfast ready when you're ready to come down." "Yes, ma'am," Clara replied, still amazed that a white woman was treating her with such kindness and respect. "We'll be down in a few minutes." As Clara helped her children dress in the clean clothes that Mrs. Patterson had provided, she explained what would happen next. "We're going to stay with these nice people for a little while," she told Samuel and Mary. "They're going to help us get to a place where we can be free." "What does free mean, Mama?" Mary asked, her 5-year-old mind struggling with a concept she had never experienced. Clara paused, realizing that her children had no frame of reference for freedom. They had been born into slavery, had never known a world where they could make their own choices or go where they wanted. "Free means that no one can tell us what to do except ourselves," Clara explained. "Free means we can live together as a family, and no one can ever sell us or separate us. Free means you can learn to read and write, and maybe even go to school someday." Samuel's eyes widened. "Really, Mama? We could learn to read?" "Yes, baby boy. In the place we're going, children like you go to school every day." When they came downstairs, they found Mrs. Patterson and her husband, Thomas, waiting in the kitchen with a breakfast that seemed like a feast to Clara's eyes: fresh bread, eggs, bacon, milk, and fruit that Clara's children had never tasted before. "Please, sit down and eat," Mr. Patterson said, his weathered face kind but serious. "You'll need your strength for the journey ahead." As they ate, the Pattersons explained the next phase of their escape. Clara and her children would be hidden in a secret compartment beneath their wagon and transported to Savannah, where they would board a ship bound for Philadelphia. The journey would take several days and would be dangerous, but it was their best chance of reaching true freedom. "There are slave catchers all along the roads between here and Savannah," Mrs. Patterson explained. "They're offering substantial rewards for your capture, and they have descriptions of you and the children. We'll need to be very careful." Clara felt a chill of fear. "How do they have descriptions of us?" Mr. Patterson's expression grew grim. Word travels fast in these parts. Your former master has posted notices in every town between here and the coast. He's offering $100 for your return, $50 for each child. $100. Clara's mind reeled at the amount. That was more money than most people earned in several years. Every bounty hunter, slave catcher, and desperate person in Georgia would be looking for them. But don't worry, Mrs. Patterson added quickly, seeing the fear in Clara's eyes. We've been helping people reach freedom for 15 years, and we've never lost anyone yet. You just need to trust us and follow our instructions exactly. Over the next 2 days, Clara and her children rested and prepared for the final leg of their journey. Mrs. Patterson taught Clara how to read and write her new name, Sarah Johnson, and helped her memorize the details of her cover story. Samuel and Mary practiced being quiet for long periods, understanding that their lives might depend on their ability to remain silent and still. Clara also learned more about the Underground Railroad network that was helping them. It was a vast, secret organization of abolitionists, free blacks, and sympathetic whites who risked their own freedom to help enslaved people escape. The network stretched from the Deep South all the way to Canada, with safe houses, secret routes, and coded messages that allowed information to travel faster than any official communication. There are thousands of us, Mr. Patterson told Clara one evening as they sat by the fire. Quakers, Methodists, free blacks, even some former slaves who made it north and came back to help others. We believe that slavery is a sin against God, and we're willing to risk everything to help people like you find freedom. Clara was amazed by the courage of these people who had nothing to gain and everything to lose by helping fugitive slaves. The Pattersons could be imprisoned, fined, or even killed if they were caught harboring runaways. Yet they continued their work because they believed it was right. On the third morning, Mr. Patterson announced that it was time to leave. A contact in Savannah had confirmed that a ship would be departing for Philadelphia in 2 days, and they needed to reach the city in time to board it. Clara felt a mixture of excitement and terror as she prepared for the final phase of their escape. They were so close to freedom now, but this last stretch would be the most dangerous. Savannah was a major port city with federal marshals, slave catchers, and